Hello and welcome to today's context-free live stream in which I'll be discussing the National Portrait Gallery in London and highlighting a few of the masterpieces in the gallery. My name is Hattie Bennett and I'm a freelance art history lecturer based in London. I've been a context docent for 7 years and frequently give Zoom lectures to context audiences. Without further ado, I'm going to discuss my seminar outline. I'm going to very briefly talk about the history of the National Portrait Gallery. And the gallery itself, of course, has a linear kind of historic approach to displaying the paintings. So I thought I'd take that approach too. So we're going to start with the Tudors, then the Jacobians and Stuarts, the Georgians, the Victorians, and then finally we'll finish with the 20th century. This is the new opening entrance to the National Portrait Gallery. You can see it's this rather grand kind of Victorian building. Up here we've got various roundels of British artists, male artists, of course. And if we have a look at the old entrance, we can see that it's very grand, but it is in a slightly awkward area, which is on a bend of St Martin's Lane. This is the National Gallery on Trafalgar Square, which is next to it. It also, as you can see, has stairs up to the entrance, and there's more stairs to get into the gallery. So this is a much kind of better appeal. And when you go in, there's a lovely big atrium, nice shop, and the flow of the gallery is much better. The National Portrait Gallery has reopened and it looks fantastic, as Time Out said, and I totally agree with it. Although we have very much missed for the last 3 years being able to go and see our familiar faces. So it's open daily, apart from Christmas Day and Boxing Day, and it's free. It was founded in 1856 with the aim of collecting portraits of the most eminent persons in British history, to look at the celebrity of the person represented rather than the merit of the artist. Now, the National Portrait Gallery has portraits by amateur artists like Cassandra Austin, but it also includes fantastic artists by David Hockney, Lucian Freud, Joshua Reynolds, Thomas Gainsborough, etc., etc. So it's rather varied. There are 11,000 painted and sculpted portraits. There's 250,000 photographs, 80,000 prints and drawings, a great reference library. It also holds exhibitions. The one at the moment is Paul McCartney's photographs of his years on the road as a Beatle. There is also an annual portrait award, the BP Portrait Award. As much as an institution of public history as an art gallery, and I think that is so true. The National Portrait Gallery's USP is that it's a stroll around kind of English history, literally putting faces to the names of English and British history. These are just the 3 great bronze doors, which were rather kept secret. It's difficult to see, but each plaque has a design on it made by the wonderful Tracy Emin. Now, I mentioned that there were lots of Victorian images of male artists on the gallery. Well, she has addressed that, and we have these images of women in her characteristic linear style. The National Portrait Gallery reopened very recently in June after 3 years of refurbishment. It cost £41 million, but it was completed on time and on budget. So my first gallery is the Tudors, and as well as creating this new flow to the gallery galleries have also been rehung and given these very strong colours, which literally sort of colour the different sort of times. So for the Tudors, they've gone for this rather kind of grand royal blue. My first image is, of course, one of the most famous images of a very famous English king, and that is Henry VIII. Now, it's a cartoon, it's a work of art on paper, and it's by the great Swiss-German artist Hans Holbein, who comes over to England in the 1520s and then returns in the 1530s. I've put a picture which is actually on loan at the gallery at the moment of Henry VIII's grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. And just to kind of clarify the uh, sophistication of Holbein and what he brings to English art. Now, we don't have an English art school. We don't have a training academies really until the 18th century. And when monarchs or kind of grand courtiers wanted a portrait made, an artist, an itinerant artist from the continent would come, and English court artists were often kind of Netherlandish or later Flemish. So if we look at the picture of Lady Margaret Beaufort, here she is looking rather flat. Behind her, we can see she's got her cloth of estate with symbols of her imagery, of her heraldry, so portcullis, the Tudor rose. The Tudor rose is this very, very endearing or enduring image of the Tudor dynasty, which saw the end of the Wars of the Roses, linking of the two great families, the Lancastrians and the Yorkists, through their personal devices, which are the white and red rose. So the Tudor rose kind of has both of them together. When we come to Holbein's image of Henry, we don't have any of that kind of heraldry. Instead, we have this very, very sophisticated context in which he stands, which is looking to the art of Italy, the Renaissance. These pilasters over here are very much inspired by classical artworks which have been rediscovered, places like the Golden House of Nero in Rome, utilised or reused by people like Raphael, decorating the Vatican lodges and so on. So Henry here is the Renaissance prince, if you like. And then when we look at the figure of Henry himself, this kind of obese man has been absolutely translated into a vision of power, the way that his stance is, the way that he is holding his dagger in his hand. Behind him, we have the rather slim figure of his father, Henry VII. The cartoon was a working kind of device used by Holbein for creating a large mural. Now, the mural itself was destroyed in a fire in the 18th century, which took away the whole palace in which this thing was first made. But we do have a copy of what the image may have looked like. And it's the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII, in defeating the last Plantagenet king, had quite a tenuous claim to the English throne. So by reinforcing the kind of power of this fledgling dynasty, Holbein is using the images of the two royal houses, as I mentioned, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, and Henry's parents, Henry himself, and then, of course, Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, who is going to be the mother of his only surviving son. So therefore, the dynasty continues. It was imagined to be life-size, this mural, probably for one of the privy chambers that Henry used. Perhaps this object here even may have been where the throne and the cloth of estate was. The figures probably were life-size. And what Holbein has done, which is different in the finished painting to the cartoon, is that he's turned Henry's head slightly, so he's looking out at the painting. Another rather famous Tudor is Anne Boleyn, and although Holbein was at the court during her own lifetime, sadly, her downfall means that if he did paint a portrait of her, it has been destroyed, lost, whatever. There's a big controversy about a drawing that he may have made of the Queen. We know from a written account that she had black and beautiful eyes. There's that familiar bee that we know so well for Boleyn, although there is current thought or discussion that this may represent a member of the Brandon family, in which case it's not Anne herself. I've just put a couple of images up of Anne that are not at the National Portrait Gallery. This is at the British Museum. This is the Most Happy Medal, struck in Anne's lifetime, the only contemporary image that we have, where we see that she has this oval face. She's obviously very slim, slender. She has rather a large nose, though, which is not quite so evident in the portrait, if it is indeed of Anne. And then the little tiny checkers ring that was called checkers, that's called the checkers ring because that is where this thing is kept in a private home, or the home of the official home of the Prime Minister, country home. You can see the ER on it in diamonds, and then when the ring opens up, there's a little image of Elizabeth herself, and then of a woman wearing a French hood, which of course is associated with the period that Anne lived in. And then a very famous non-royal Tudor is William Shakespeare. Now, William Shakespeare, this portrait was given to the gallery by Lord Ellesmere, one of the founders. It is NPG 1. It is the first painting that comes into the collection. the figure of Shakespeare looks kind of mistily mysterious, if you like, in it. And of course, paintings from the 17th, 16th, 17th century are very hard to kind of give a firm attribution to. However, the image of Shakespeare conforms very much to the famous print from the first folio, and indeed from Shakespeare's funeral monument in the church that he's buried in Stratford, the same sort of beard and hair, receding hairline, and so on. What the National Portrait Gallery also does, as well as displaying paintings, is also sort of more ephemeral kind of works of art. And so what I've put up here is a little Staffordshire pottery bust made in the 19th century. During the 1860s, of course, the 300-year anniversary of Shakespeare's birth, there was a lot of these kind of objects that were created. And of course, the pottery bust very much refers to the Chandos portrait, as this is called. I love when you come and look at this picture, if you look very carefully, there's a tiny little gold earring, just a little C in gilding that we have here. John Taylor, the artist, I mean, absolutely nothing is proven about him. There was a John Taylor, interestingly, that was an actor, member of a troupe of artists known to Shakespeare. I'm now going to move on to Jacobean and Stuart paintings. So the Jacobean period refers to James I and VI of Scotland, who is invited to London on the death of the childless Elizabeth Tudor, Elizabeth I. And the paintings that we're looking at here are from the Restoration period of Charles II in their wonderful original frames. And I talk about this more in my extended talk. Frames around portraits are really interesting for historians because they very often retain their original frame. They don't get lost like other paintings that sort of change hands many, many times by old masters and so on. And you can see these are rather stunning, the ones for the Charles II period. There are prints displayed around the gallery as well. This one, made in 1605, commemorates our gunpowder plot, 5th of November. This is when a bunch of Catholic English gentlemen decided to try and blow up James I, the King, and his court, and the members of the House of Lords. Unwisely, one of the members wrote a note to a relative that was in part of the King's train, warning him not to go. And of course, their cover was then blown. Guy Fawkes was found in a cellar, surrounded by gunpowder, holding a match almost. And these traitors were either killed during their capture or then executed as tyrants. These are 8 of the 13 conspirators, but what I think is interesting about this broadsheet is it has 3 languages below: Latin, French, and German. In other words, this is a print that is made for consuming not just in England, but of course also on the continent as well. There's Guy Fawkes, who's probably the most famous of the plotters over there in the middle. Now, 100 years after Holbein captured Henry VIII's court, we get Van Dyke capturing the court of Charles I. Now, Charles I, who loses his head at the end of his reign after the Second English Civil War, was well served by a court painter who come from the Netherlands, Daniel Meitens, and this is an example of his work. However, Anthony Van Dyke arrives from Flanders in the 1620s, and it is by his brush that we get to know Charles I's court. This is a self-portrait of Sir Anthony Van Dyke, made in England in this incredible frame that he probably designed himself, with these great organic sort of auricular features, mask at the bottom, sunflower at the top, in this typical Van Dyke pose, which is twisting, looking over one shoulder. And this is how he can give kind of movement to a static figure, but also interest to these rich fabrics that his sitters often wear, these silks. Van Dyke's father was a silk merchant, which I think is always worth remembering when you're considering a Van Dyke painting. The image here, which is in the National Portrait Gallery, is a courtier dressed as a shepherd. This kind of pastoral display was very popular in court masks and in poetry. And the kind of lovelorn shepherd is honest love, if you like. It's not the great sort of merging of aristocratic families. It's pure love. And George Stuart, who is a Scot, had just married an English noblewoman, Catherine Howard, really without permission of the king. This is what is being celebrated in this painting. So we've got just here in Latin the legend that says, I couldn't help love, I couldn't compete with love. And then we've got the English rose and the Scottish thistle. There's a poignancy to Van Dyck's portraits of the court because, of course, this is the generation of young men that are going to be slaughtered on the battlefield. George Stuart dies aged 24 at the Battle of Edge Hill. Now, Pepys is a regular Londoner. He works for the Naval Office. He's going to become he's going to become an MP, but he is most beloved and famed for his diary that he keeps in the 1660s. And in that, he talks about the Great Plague, the restoration of Charles II, the Great Fire of London, as well as, his everyday life. And one of my favourite passages is his description of having this portrait made. So he goes off to his artist, and of course wants to be painted in this fashionable style that had been established by Van Dyck 40 years before. So in other words, looking over his shoulder. I sit to have it full of shadows, and so almost break my neck looking over my shoulder to make the posture for him to work by. He sits till quite dark, so it takes quite a long time. And then, interestingly, he hires himself what he describes as an Indian gown, which may be perhaps a cotton gown. But in any case, to have your portrait made, of course, you want to wear your Sunday best, or if you haven't got a Sunday best, you hire your Sunday best. He pays £14 for the painting and an extra 25 shillings for the frame and is well satisfied. Now we're going to look at the Georgians. Rather nice dense hang here. It reminds us of the way that the Royal Academy, established in the 1760s, would display its paintings in its great exhibitions, much to the irritation of artists like Gainsborough, who didn't like the idea that paintings were hung so high up that people couldn't really see them. So we've got politicians here. We've got Charles James Fox. We've got Pitt. We've got Lady Hamilton and mistress of Horatio Nelson. But I'm going to start by talking about this wonderful painting here of Oh My. Now, Oh My is painted by Joshua Reynolds, who really is the great father of English establishment art. There had been people like William Hogarth in the early 18th century, little pinpricks of English-born artists, but the systematic training and display with a royal charter is really down to Joshua Reynolds, which is great. But Reynolds also had his own vision of how sitters should be painted in portraits. And he didn't want to look to nature. He told his students, never look to nature, but look to the art of the past, of the classics, of the classical kind of tradition, and also of the Renaissance. So when we look at the figure of My, or Oh My, we can see here that he's got this kind of classical pose that is not, from Oh My in his kind of natural state, kind of walking around the studio or anything. Reynolds is basically referring to a classical ideal. Now, Oh My himself was Tahitian. He had come over to England on a ship captained by Captain Cook. And he arrived in London and was much, kind of admired for his beauty, his poise. He was invited to the court. And of course, Reynolds paints him. Now, Reynolds paints him using a bit of artistic license, particularly with the background, but also, in giving him a turban, you see, which, of course, is not a method of dress from that particular area. I've also included the self-portrait of Reynolds from the National Portrait Gallery, painted, when he's a young man. And I really cannot think of a better image of an artist at the cusp beginning of his career. Now, I mentioned Nelson and Lady Hamilton, but I've put him up here with the Duke of Wellington. So these are the great British defeaters of the Napoleonic armies and navy. Horatio Nelson in this very, very lively portrait by William Beechey. I absolutely adore it. This was commissioned by his hometown in Norfolk. We have an idea of, kind of stormy skies behind him, this really alert, always kind of photographic expression that he's got on his face. And then, of course, his orders kind of glinting and shining on his jacket there. It's a good contrast to Lawrence's portrait of the Duke of Wellington. Now, the Duke of Wellington, unlike poor old Nelson, who dies at the moment of his great victory in 1805, has a very long career after his soldiering, and he in fact becomes British Prime Minister. And it's that kind of urbane appeal as politician that is being portrayed in this image here by Sir Thomas Lawrence. The painting, as you can see, is unfinished. The National Portrait Gallery does not care about that, which is great, because to enjoy unfinished pictures, to look at an unfinished painting means that you get to enjoy the way that the artist works, so that we can see here that there's this great kind of concentration on the sitter's face. It's quite flattering. Wellington, we know, had a very beautiful large Roman nose, but by painting him in this way, we can kind of get an idea of the characterization of that feature, but also it is kind of artfully kind of hidden in the shadow. I noticed when I was researching this that there are 640 portraits. I mean, they're not all painted, of Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, which I think is great. I mean, it reflects the kind of interest that the Victorians and the 20th century had on this character. One of the most beloved images at the National Portrait Gallery is an image by an amateur, by Cassandra Austin, of her sister Jane. It was sketched in pencil and watercolour in about 1810, and it was used as the basis of a later engraving by Richard Bentley, which has rather softened Jane's features. Cassandra was well aware of this, and she says in the note that I've written out here that although it's a very pleasing, sweet face, it's not very much like the original. The printed image, the Richard Bentley image, is the one that we're probably most familiar with. This is the one that gets reproduced in Jane Austen's books, and indeed is the basis for the portrait of Jane on the back of our £10 note. There are many, many examples of eminent Victorians in the National Portrait Gallery, but I've gone for another literary group. These two little images are by Bramwell Bronte, the brother of the Bronte sisters. He had trained at the Royal Academy, but never fulfilled his potential. He paints these two images of his sisters sometime in the 1830s. This one here has a ghostly image of Bramwell himself, which he presumably painted out at a later date. This one is a fragment of a larger picture of Emily. Charlotte Bronte's widower cut it out of the painting done by Bramwell as he thought it good, this image, but the others were bad. So sadly, we've lost the other two sisters. Mrs. Gaskell recognises that technically they're not very good, but the likenesses, she says, I think are admirable. These paintings were lost until the early 20th century, when they were discovered in an Irish country house by Charlotte's widower's second wife, tucked up, folded up on top of a wardrobe. And despite the poor quality, as you can see, of the images, they nevertheless are a very, very precious and significant part of the collection. And now I'm going to move on to the 20th century. The paintings that are exhibited at the National Portrait Gallery from the 20th century are so wide-ranging in kind of, well, not just in sitters, of course, but in technique. So, when you look at this wall, we can see a wonderful picture, pop art picture of Anna Wintour over here without her glasses. We have something rather more academic over here, another kind of pop art image over here of Michael Eavis, the founder of Glastonbury Festival, and of course, photography. And my last image, I'm going to go for a photograph of Malala Yousafzai, of course, the young woman who was singled out by the Taliban and shot on her way to school. She's an activist for women and girls' rights to education. This is a photograph taken by Shirin Neshat, who described Malala as an extraordinary young woman. And when I look back on our encounter, I am left with the impressions of humility, wisdom, and a rare sense of inner beauty. She took a series of photographs of Malala, and for this one, she has superimposed over Malala's face this beautiful calligraphy, which is a poem by a Pashto contemporary poet, which describes the life of a historical Malala, another activist, if you like, who who agitated against the British in the 19th century Afghani rebellion. That's the end of my lecture. It's a very, very brief introduction to some of the highlights of the National Portrait Gallery. If you want to learn a little more about the National Portrait Gallery, I have done a more extensive lecture. There is a link below. So please, if you're interested, do click on that and the link will take you to the fuller lecture. Thank you very much for joining me.